I was a witness to the first year or so of the first Palestinian Intifada, and I witnessed, the behaviour of the Israeli military against the Palestinians. I was disgusted. I was a witness to the absolute endemic racism against the Palestinians. There was no turning back for me then.
Is Ireland a natural ally for Palestinians? In 1980, Ireland became the first European Union member to endorse the establishment of a Palestinian state. In 2014, both houses of the Irish Parliament unanimously passed a motion calling on the government to recognise the state of Palestine. But despite successive promises from Irish foreign ministers that Ireland would lead the way, to this day, this hasn't come into effect. Part of that could be down to Ireland's long-maintained policy of neutrality. They didn't take part in World War II, for example. But that has been tested when Russia invaded Ukraine, stirring a debate about whether that policy of neutrality needs to change. But if Ireland no longer becomes neutral, what would its foreign policy look like? Would it differ from the rest of Europe and the US, who have long been allies and staunch backers of Israel? Welcome to The Big Picture, a show about the past, the present, and the future. My name is Mohammed Hassan. Today we are speaking to Irish lawmaker Richard Boyd Barett. Barett is an outspoken and fiery member of Ireland's Dáil Éireann, the lower house of parliament, with the People Before Profit Party. For decades, he's been a prominent voice in the country's anti-war movement, leading the historic marches in 2003 against the US invasion of Iraq. He's also been a strident supporter of Palestinian rights. Last year, his speeches in Parliament criticizing the media coverage and politics around the war in Ukraine went viral. He was arguing there's a double standard in how Ukrainian resistance is valorized, yet Palestinians fighting occupation are instead painted as terrorists.
They are calling for targeted sanctions against Israeli officials who are perpetuating the system of apartheid, just exactly the same types of sanctions you've just initiated against Vladimir Putin. Will you support it? That there should be a state that gives priority to one religious group over another is a recipe for the oppression of the other. And is a recipe to incite and encourage sectarianism, ethnic cleansing and violent conflict. We should know this from our own history. Surely Israel has reached that point where we can say that the sort of action that finally brought apartheid South Africa to heel is necessary for the rogue state and the apartheid state of Israel.
Richard Boyd Barett, welcome to The Big Picture. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Mohammed.
So you are here in London currently taking part in the Marxism conference to talk specifically about Palestine.
I come over most years to the Marxism conference. It's a fantastic event that kind of looks at just about everything that's happening in the world. But Palestine would always be a major issue at this conference. And obviously it's a major issue for me. And this year we'll be looking at the 75th anniversary of Nakba. And there's a panel that includes Loki, myself, some British-based speakers, Palestinians talking about, what can we say after 75 years of ongoing Nakba? It's not, tragically, the Nakba is not a historical event. It's an ongoing reality for the Palestinians, and we see it every single day of the week. The continued ethnic cleansing, the continued theft of Palestinian land, obviously the most deadly year for Palestinians in recent years, the killing of children most horrifically. And we need to continue to ring the alarm bells and demand action, accountability, sanctions for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. It's just shocking that this continues and that the world sits by and allows it to happen, and allows Israel the impunity to commit these horrendous crimes against the Palestinian people.
As an Irish lawmaker yourself, you've been very vocal about the Palestinian issue. But interestingly enough, Ireland itself has a long history of pro-Palestinian stances. Ireland in the 60s was very concerned and very vocal about Palestinian refugees and the issues of the consequences of the Nakba and the following conflicts. But over time, there's also been a lot of kinship between governments of Ireland and Palestinian administrations. Why is that? What is it about this issue that feels strong for Ireland?
I mean, I think first of all, you're absolutely right. There is an almost instinctive sense of solidarity between the people of Ireland and the Palestinians, as there was with the black population of South Africa when they were fighting apartheid. And there was always that very, very strong consciousness of the parallels in all of those struggles, that we were the victims of empire and colonialism, and that a key part of the strategy of empire and colonialism was a form of apartheid. In Ireland, it was called the penal laws, which were a set of laws that were systematically racist, designed to sort of create a hierarchy where the colonial settlers had different laws that applied to them, to the indigenous Catholic population. And that was all part of a divide and rule strategy and a strategy of subjugation, where they tried to wipe out the language, and sadly to a significant extent, not fully, but did succeed, to erase Irish culture, and of course, ongoing brutal subjugation of Irish resistance, which never stopped. And those parallels are very, very strong. And I think, a point I make regularly is that, in fact, some of the key architects of the British colonial operation in Ireland were also some of the key architects of the Zionist project and what was done to the Palestinians. And many of the personnel that were actually leading commanders and officers and the politicians above them who were involved in trying to subdue the Irish Revolution, particularly in the kind of 1918 to 1921 period, were sent after that there was finally a settlement with Britain, were sent direct to Palestine. Many of the actual same officers, and they pursued precisely the same policies. And it's brilliantly, shockingly in a way, summed up by Ronald Storrs, the first British Governor General of Jerusalem in 1936, when asked about their support for the Zionist project. And he said, "Our aim is to create a loyal little Jewish Ulster in the Middle East to guard against a potentially hostile sea of Arabism." So Ulster, of course, is a province in the north, most associated with colonial settlement of Ireland and the divide and rule tactic between Catholic and Protestant. So they very consciously exported the model that they had imposed on Ireland to Palestine, with terrible consequences. But I suppose from the Palestinian point of view, the thing to take heart is that that project ultimately did not succeed. That despite the brutality of the British colonial occupation, the resistance never stopped in Ireland. Sadly, it took hundreds of years. There were many failed revolutions, but eventually the revolution did drive Britain out of most of Ireland. And I think most people would say at the moment that we're not far from uniting Ireland completely and ending British rule in the north. That's something that I would like to think might happen in my lifetime.
Yeah. And what is, the very clearly there's a parallel there, and there's a connection with the relationship with the British Empire, with the modern day kind of British and European policies when it comes to support for Israel and support for occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. What is the relationship between Ireland and Britain today? What does that look like?
That's a very interesting question. It has been transformed. When I first would have started to come to London as a youngster, Irish people coming here were subject to racist stereotyping. There was the thought in many British people's heads that almost every Irish person was a terrorist. You'd be asked about paramilitarism and bombing, and there was still that.
Sounds a little bit familiar.
Exactly.
I know what that's like.
Exactly. And there were stereotypes about the Irish being prone to violence, being less than rational. So many of the stereotypes you now see associated with Palestinians and with the Arab population and with Muslim people were being applied to the Irish. for hundreds of years, in fact. I mean, if you look at some of the racist cartoon tabloid press of the 19th century, it's really incredible, the parallels, because the Irish were portrayed as less than human, as sort of monkeys, violent, sexually deviant, essentially less than human. And all of that same racist stereotyping is now applied to Muslim people in particular, but also to many people in the global south.
Isn't that crazy how these stereotypes get recycled in different periods of time?
It is, and shocking that they can persist. When you would think that after what happened in Ireland, and that relationship, and you asked, has the relationship changed? And it has. I mean, it's interesting now, Irish people are very popular in Britain. That sort of anti-Irish racism has more or less disappeared, which is a cause for hope, and should be a cause for hope for the Palestinians and for Muslims across the world and black people across the world, that it can change, and it has changed. But critical to it changing was Ireland liberating itself. And it was struggle, it was resistance, it was revolution in Ireland, an ongoing resistance that eventually forced Britain out of Ireland and ultimately sort of led to the acknowledgement that actually we're just human beings like everybody else who have the right to self-determination and to freedom and justice. So it was a long struggle, but it proves it can be done. But I think there is, for that reason, just an instinctive identification and solidarity among the majority of people in Ireland with people in a similar situation, and the parallels with Palestine are so strong. And of course, when we see what's happening in the West Bank, the sort of Israeli military going in there, demolishing houses, harassing people day in, day out with checkpoints, administrative detention. In Ireland, that was called internment. You were arrested and imprisoned without trial. All of these things are things we're very familiar with in Ireland, and we can see what Israel is doing for what it is, and no amount of pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli propaganda can convince the majority of people in Ireland that there's anything justified about what Israel is doing. But I will say that the Irish government, unfortunately, they're better rhetorically than most governments in Europe. And, you were alluding to that in your earlier question, that historically they've kind of had to express empathy and some degree of solidarity because of that legacy in our country. But sadly, they don't go much beyond words. And I think they're forced to do it because that's what the population feel. But then at the top level of Irish politics, among these sort of establishment parties, they themselves privately are very keen to be part of the European club, the NATO club. They're shockingly deferential to the United States foreign policy. So they don't want to do anything to rock that boat. So they say things verbally, but don't do much in practice. And that's something that we want to continue to put pressure on them over.
Yeah, so an example of that, in 2014, both houses of the Parliament in Ireland voted almost unanimously to recognize a Palestinian state. But then to this day, it's almost been 10 years, that actually hasn't happened. Is there a pathway for that to happen, or is it just, as you said, rhetoric that the government is comfortable saying?
Well, it's even this government, which is a centre-right government, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, for your viewers if they're not aware of the names of these parties, both, by the way, just so people know, who originally came from the historic Sinn Féin party and from the Republican movement that led the revolution, but then split after the establishment of the southern state and became very conservative forces. Another interesting lesson about anti-colonial struggle, that the revolutionaries don't always stay revolutionaries.
The Middle East is a textbook
exactly
example of that.
Yes, the fact that resolutions were passed in the Houses of the Parliament recognising a Palestinian state. Also, a bill was passed saying there should be absolutely no trade and a boycott of trade with the occupied territories. More recently, there was a motion passed, again, but with all party support, declaring the settlements on the West Bank as illegal annexation of territory from a legal point of view. So all these are good things, but they were pushed from the bottom up. They were pushed by Palestinian solidarity activists, by the left in the parliament, but the government have been reluctant to do anything with them because, of course, they're looking over their shoulder at the European Union, who they want to be in with, and the United States, who don't want them to do anything about it. So they drag their heels and they make excuses saying, well, we can't act unilaterally from our European partners. We'll do it when the time is right. So it's excuse after excuse. Now, I mean, the good thing is it's a lot better than, for example, in Britain, where they're explicitly pro-Zionist, the main parties here. So we're in a better position, we're in a stronger position, but yet they drag their heels and they try and frustrate actual practical sanctions on Israel. So that's the pressure point. And we just have to maximise that pressure. I think it will take a change of government, and that's in the offing. The left, particularly Sinn Féin, are kind of the dominant opposition party now, and they would have a good policy on Palestine. They don't go as far as I would like them to go, to be quite honest, but it's a hell of a lot better than the government policy, and they have backed all of these resolutions about the recognition of the Palestinian state, about ending trade, at least with the settlements, and about declaring the seizure of Palestinian territory as illegal, and so on. So I think they would have to act on them if they came into power, and that's very possible in the next year or two, but we'll continue to put pressure on them, because pressure can come on governments. I mean, I have seen some shocking U-turns from parties that claim themselves to be on the left on some of these matters. Most notably, the vast majority of the left in Ireland would have campaigned, and we saw massive demonstrations against the use of Shannon Airport, one of our airports, by the US troops to prosecute the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The vast majority of the population were disgusted at that. And then we had parties who were part of that movement demanding that stop, then went into government, most notably the Labour Party and the Green Party, and when they got into government did a U-turn and did nothing about it and continued to allow it to happen. So for me, the lesson is, it's good to hear people saying the right things, and we need to put them to the test, but you always need the movement from the bottom, pushing to make sure they actually keep to their word.
And the anti-war movement is something that you were quite prominent in, and the movement against the war in Iraq. How did you yourself get involved in that? What kind of drew you to this battleground that you very much see yourself as a part of now?
Well, Palestine and the Palestinian people are to blame for my involvement in politics.
They radicalized you?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I would have been to the left as a youngster, because of music, funny enough. Punk music, would you believe, when I was a youngster, which was quite political and quite left-wing. But I didn't know a hell of a lot about Palestine, and I don't think I probably would have ended up as somebody who would spend the rest of their life involved in political activity, were it not for the fact that when I was about 18, I went with friends of mine. We were working here in London on building sites, and I took a year out of college, and we then went in 1987 to Israel. We didn't know anything about the political situation, and we ended up working on a farm in the south of Israel, in the Negev, on the Jordanian border. And within a day or two, I was working alongside Palestinians who were refugees from Hebron, who were coming as day labourers, and they began to tell me about their life and their history. And it took me, about half an hour to realise, okay, there's something very badly wrong, and to identify with these Palestinians I was working with. And that really transformed me. I mean, so I was there, I was a witness to the first year or so of the first Palestinian Intifada, and I went to stay with my friends in the refugee camp near Hebron, and I witnessed the behaviour of the Israeli military against the Palestinians. I was disgusted. I was a witness to the absolute endemic racism against the Palestinians, shocking racism that just pervaded Israeli society. So there was no turning back for me then. When I got back to Ireland, I was absolutely determined to start to advocate for the Palestinian cause. And that obviously drew me then into the anti-war movement as well. The first Gulf War happened in 1991. So I got through myself into involvement in that. Because of course, once you realise about Palestine, you also realise
A lot of other things
there's a web
Yeah.
of imperialism in the Middle East.
And today, how do you see that same movement, that same drive?
For me personally, or
For you personally?
For me personally, I mean, everything that you see drives you on to be more committed to support the Palestinian cause, because there was a phrase from the late 60s, early 70s, I don't know who coined it, but it certainly would have been a popular phrase in Ireland during the civil rights movement, the late 60s, early 70s in the north, was there was one world, one struggle. And I really believe that in my bones, that if you're talking about freedom and justice, then it is part of a fight, an international fight, where you always have to side with the ordinary working people, with the oppressed and the exploited of the world. And Palestine is very much pivotal to all of that. But the other thing that is how inspiring the Palestinian resistance is, and that was something that certainly impacted on me way back in 1987 and has never left me, is to see the young people, and it was young people that I was working with. They were 18, 19 and 20, and they were the people who were driving the Intifada. It wasn't some of the political organizations that whose names we're now very familiar with, whether it was the PLO or Hamas. That's not what I saw. Like, they seemed to be largely not present in that first Intifada. It was just young people who said, we're not putting up with this, and who rose up and resisted in the most heroic way against the most unbelievable odds. And I still think that's true today. And I think, in fact, there's a new youth radicalization from what I can see in Palestine, and I think it reflects a youth radicalization and politicization that's happening around the world, about war and imperialism, about the climate, about the failure of the system to offer a future to young people on some of the most basic things like housing and healthcare, and as well as those big issues of war, imperialism, and climate change. So I'm optimistic in my own way. As terrible as what's happening to the Palestinians is, I think actually we're winning the war of hearts and minds. And you have to win the war of hearts and minds before you win the political battle, in my opinion. But I think we're winning that. And I think the level of awareness about how terrible the oppression and persecution of the Palestinians is as much more widespread across the world than it was when I was 18. And I think that's growing, and that's mostly down to the heroism and determination and resilience of the Palestinian people. It's also to do with a movement that has grown from that across the world.
And isn't it the fact that the law of return, which is the basic law of the Israeli state, is a racist apartheid law, because it confers rights on Jews that it denies to Palestinians. It allows, for example, if I was Jewish and had never stepped foot in Israel, I could claim citizenship there tomorrow, but 6 million people whose origins are in what you now call Israel, who were forced out in 1947 or 48, do not have that right. Isn't that part of the reason why the Palestinians are in dispute with Israelis? Because you deny them the right to return to their homes and to their land and to their villages, and that they have a legitimate claim, even under international law, to return, but you deny them that right. Why do you deny them that right? And why do you give that right to other people who have no connection whatsoever with the land, whether you call it Israel or whether you call it Palestine?
A lot of people often make parallels with apartheid South Africa and the resistance movement there, and the way that was initially perceived by the international community. That the ANC was a terrorist organization under British law until the 90s, even after apartheid was over. Nelson Mandela was talked about as a terrorist leader, and it's an interesting parallel that you draw also with Irish resistance and the independence movement, with what's happening in Palestine, what happened during the Intifadas, but also today. And there's often this conversation internationally around that this resistance, specifically armed resistance, goes counter to the efforts to try and bring about a kind of lasting peace in the region, or a kind of independence for Palestinians. How do you see that? I mean, do you think the Irish could have gained independence had they gone through the international peace talk route?
Again, a very good question. No, to put it simply, no. It was revolution. Now, there is a serious debate about what is a revolution, or what is the most effective form of revolutionary struggle. Is it small numbers of paramilitaries, or is it a mass popular movement that may also involve armed resistance? And certainly, even under international law, not that I think international law is the be-all and end-all of things, but even under international law, to my mind, there's not a single question but that the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance. I mean, if the West can say, without even thinking about it, the Ukrainian people have the right to armed resistance against the Russian invasion, and indeed then go on to arm them with missiles, with tanks, with guns, how does that right not apply to the Palestinian people? Do they not have the right to resist what is obviously a colonial theft of their land, and an apartheid regime that is absolutely blatant and abhorrent, or the siege of Gaza, which is self-evidently a war crime, a collective punishment of 2 million people? Of course, the Palestinian people have the right to resist, and to resist by force of arms. But I do think you have to ask the question, is that always the best way to make the revolution, which is necessary? And I do think there is, to my mind, there's a question mark over that. And I would say that about Ukraine too. I mean, the military, the conventional military conflict that is in Ukraine has terrifying possibilities. When you think about the potential for nuclear weapons, I have no doubt the Ukrainians have the right to resist what Putin is doing to their country. But is the way to do it by aligning with NATO and potentially bidding up the escalation of the conflict to the point where nuclear weapons are exchanged and where hundreds of thousands of people are getting killed? Is that the best way to prosecute the revolution? I'm not sure.
And you've been very critical of NATO specifically, and its role in the Ukrainian resistance effort. Specifically, saying that this was a big part of this was NATO expansionism, and that was really what NATO was getting out of it, as opposed to necessarily helping the Ukrainian people. Why do you feel that way?
Because, I mean, and you've got to be careful how you put this, because I don't for 1 minute doubt the right of the Ukrainian people to resist an occupation of their land. But I do seriously doubt, question, and disagree with them aligning with NATO, because I don't think NATO give a damn about the Ukrainian people. And I think everything about the record of the powers that dominate NATO show, Palestine being one of the key examples, but there are many others, they don't care about the oppressed of the world. They don't care about the occupied of the world. For them, they only have strategic interests. It is strategically in their interest to expand the European Union and NATO as a military alliance to dominate more and more of the world. Just as Putin is about trying to protect his spheres of influence in an imperialistic way, and I'm against both those empires. And I don't think ultimately they have anything to offer the oppressed and the exploited of the world. When you look at what NATO did in Afghanistan, thousands and thousands of people killed, bombing the hell out of people. When you look at what the powers that dominate NATO did in Iraq, killed directly and indirectly 1 million people, completely destroyed the infrastructure of that country, destabilized the entire region. When you think about some of the awful authoritarian, despotic regimes they continue to support in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, recently you look at what's happening in Tunisia. I just find it shocking that we hear them day in, day out talking about the undoubted violation of human rights and democratic rights of the Ukrainian people. They're now talking in the Irish Parliament about what's happening in Belarus and so on. But then what about what's happening in Tunisia? where they're giving money to the Said regime that has just imprisoned all of the democratic opposition and are effectively imposing a dictatorship in Tunisia. And they say nothing because, oh, well, Europe has an interest in supporting this regime for its own selfish strategic interests.
One of the interesting conversations that's been happening in Ireland throughout the last year when the war in Ukraine began was about this idea of Irish neutrality, which has long been a policy that, specifically in terms of foreign policy and military spending, Ireland has the smallest military budget in the EU, 0.2%, I think. Can you tell me about that, why that history is so persistent in Ireland and why it's being challenged now?
Well, it kind of relates to your question about what is the most effective form of resistance, and the question of armed resistance, and debates around how do you prosecute a war, an anti-colonial revolutionary war. And the fantastic thing about the Irish Revolution is that it was a genuine popular revolution that did not, for the most part, there was some fundraising done by the Republican leaders. We're talking about the 1920s in the United States and so on. But there was not an alignment in the fight against British colonialism with other imperial powers. The driving sentiment and the driving force of the revolution was massive popular uprising. And there was an armed element to that, a significant armed guerrilla element to it. But at least, if not more important, was essentially the mass of the population simply refusing to cooperate with the colonial authorities anymore. Ireland became ungovernable by Britain. And a very significant component, catalyst in the particular sort of moment of that revolution reaching its height was opposition to the First World War, to this great imperial slaughter between big imperial blocs of the day, because Irish troops Irish people, significant numbers of them, mostly through poverty, had been forced to get involved in that war on the British side and were slaughtered in their tens and tens of thousands. And revulsion at that war led people then back into the ranks of the revolutionary uprising, as of course happened in much of the rest of Europe at that period. Ultimately, the slaughter of the First World War was ended by revolution. In Ireland, in Russia, in Germany, in Italy, the mass of ordinary people said, why are we fighting for these kings and these princes and for these rich people who are sending us out to slaughter each other? And that sentiment, that memory is deep in the Irish psyche. That our state was born in revolutionary struggle against war and imperialism and against colonialism. So that's where neutrality comes from. It was never clearly defined legally, and the government try and slide around that because it's not. They say, well, it's not absolutely defined anywhere, and it's true, it's not absolutely defined because it is something that arose from that revolutionary history and that revolutionary struggle, but it is deep in the hearts of the people. And it is about the idea we will not align ourselves with great military imperial powers. We will align ourselves with the oppressed and the exploited of the world. Now, our government, now that they're part of the international club of rulers, if you like, find that a little embarrassing, in truth. That's what I think. I think they find it when they go to these big conferences of European leaders and, Western leaders, and they're all talking about building up the industrial military complex of the Western powers. They want to be part of that club. But there's deep resistance to that from the Irish people. And most recently, I think the Irish government have been trying to seize on the Ukrainian war as an opportunity to rehabilitate the reputation of Western imperialism. Because in Ireland, we saw absolutely enormous demonstrations over the Iraq war, and people were absolutely disgusted, as we discussed earlier on, at that, their identification with Palestine. So the reputation of Western powers, US foreign policy, British foreign policy was in the trash bin in the consciousness of the mass of Irish people. But the two major conservative right parties in Ireland have been using Ukraine to try and rehabilitate that reputation by saying Putin is the bogeyman, which he is, but therefore somehow that makes NATO good. And we need to get involved in NATO, and maybe even we're under threat from Russia. This is the sort of narrative the government are trying to deploy, but the main agenda is in fact to try and undermine our neutrality, to involve us in the project of EU militarisation through arrangements like PESCO, the battle groups, which is really essentially the development of an embryonic European army, and it is directly aligned with NATO. I mean, we had the shocking fact that earlier this year there was a US general and NATO commander in Cork in the southwest of Ireland assessing Irish troops for interoperability with NATO. Now we blew the whistle about this, rang the alarm bell, said, what is this, But it's clear that the Irish government, by stealth, they don't have the confidence to do it, brazenly in front of the population because the population would react, but they do it by stealth. And in the last week or two, they had this conference where they had all these so-called academic experts on foreign policy and security policy, and then people who are in reality very closely associated with NATO and the military-industrial complex. But it was all supposed to be a sort of expert forum. But the whole point of it was to try and condition public opinion in a particular direction towards greater involvement with NATO and away from neutrality. So we had to mobilise protests against that and try and expose it for what it actually is, which is an effort to move us away from neutrality and towards alignment with the Western powers. But I'm glad to say again, Irish opinion was with us, with the anti-war movement, with the anti-imperialist movement, and I think the government's efforts to kind of brainwash them won't succeed.
You're seeing now in Germany and over the last year this kind of re-emergence of talk about Germany as a military power, and obviously there's kind of more immediate proximity to Russia that Germany has to kind of think about, and so you're seeing for the first time in decades, German military spending double and quadruple, and in an effort to try and kind of revitalize its military presence as the biggest country in Western Europe, and part of that is also, I guess, there's this movement in Germany that feels like the country has kind of been neutered as a result, and you're seeing the rise of the far right in Germany again and all of this kind of stuff, but this idea of nationalistic pride that is often coupled with military power. Is there a kind of presence like that in Ireland at all?
Not among the overwhelming majority of the population, but yes, there is, and there always has been, a minority for whom the Irish national project, independence project, wasn't particularly about identification with the oppressed and exploited of the world, or even anti-imperialistic. It was just about, can we join the club? That element, it's a minority element, but it was there right back 150 years ago. But it was always marginal, but it is there, and sadly it is disproportionately represented in the two centre-right parties of the Irish state, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, in my opinion, and they are the aspiring big business people, essentially, who want, who are associated with some of the big industrial corporate enterprises in Ireland, who want to be big players on the international stage, and for them that sort of radical anti-imperialist history now is just a bit of a baggage that they could do without, but I don't think that's how the vast majority of people feel, and every opinion poll that's been taken on the question of neutrality, for example, has shown an overwhelming majority want to hold on to neutrality, and only a tiny group, I think it's about 14 or 15%, and it's been consistent for as long as polls have been taken on this issue, on the question of NATO, want to join NATO. But 80-85% of people do not want to be part of NATO. But sadly, the two major political parties do. So, obviously, to my mind, that means it's why we need radical political change. But, this is a phenomenon I'm sure people in the Middle East are familiar with. I think, isn't there a very long-standing phenomena of leaders of Arab countries rhetorically saying they support Palestine, but in actuality doing absolutely nothing for the Palestinians, or worse,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
or actively colluding with Israel. I mean, this is, there's a long history of that, and we've seen that in Ireland too.
So the final question that I have for you is just with regards to what we've also seen happening over the last year with this Russian war in Ukraine. The Western powers, NATO and the US, really tried to rally the world around this idea of, a fight for good. And what we ended up seeing is that a lot of countries wanted to step back and say, this is not our fight. We're not going to be involved in this. We're definitely not going to be naturally siding with the side of the US. And with the emergence on the other side of Russia and its ambitions militarily, empirically, and also China, it's starting to feel like a global shift in politics. And that creates a kind of duality, but it also opens up a space for something else, a third space where countries, potentially like Ireland, can see themselves, figuring out what path they would like to take. So my final question for you is that what path would you like to see Ireland take in the future as potentially a global leader?
Yeah, well, I do think Ireland is well positioned. I think we're a very small country, but obviously we're quite a strong economy, but more importantly, we have a reputation internationally as a country that liberated itself from empire, and therefore I think a good reputation in the Middle East, among ordinary people in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. And I think we should be using that influence to be a voice of opposition to this terrifying escalation of military political competition between the big imperial powers, be they the US European axis, the Russian axis, or the Chinese axis, because it is terrifying, and it is reminiscent of what happened before the First World War. And without the First World War, we wouldn't have had the Second World War. So you think about the horror that imperialist competition has resulted in, and of course Palestine is a direct, outgrowth of all of that as well, as are many of the other horrors that have happened in Africa and Middle East and across the world. So the stakes are very, very high, and even higher when you think about the possibility of nuclear weapons. I mean, I have no doubt that there are people in the United States, in Russia, in Europe, who seriously would like to experiment with what they call tactical nuclear weapons. And the just thought is terrifying. I mean, our world is potentially finished if we go down that road. So I think it is a very urgent matter to build an international movement of resistance to warmongering, to militarism, and to empire. And so, for example, this week I brought Russian anti-war activists into the Irish Parliament to try and get their voices heard. People who are absolutely, to a man and woman, were saying, we identify with the Ukrainians' right to resist the Russian Empire and what it's doing, but we oppose Putin. And of course, the irony was very few Irish government officials came to hear them, and the Irish and many of the Western European governments aren't making it easy for people in Russia who don't want to fight in Putin's war to flee to Europe. I mean, you would think, in the same way as they have rightly allowed people flee from Ukraine and given them status to work and so on to escape the horror of the war, you would think they would open the door to ordinary Russian people who don't want to fight in Putin's war. Wouldn't that be a good way to end the war? A little bit like what happened in the First World War, where the rank and file just say, no, we don't want to fight this. We don't want to slaughter Ukrainians or Russians or anybody else. But in fact, there's an intense hypocrisy from the West on this, because I think they like the military escalation. And you look at the amount of additional expenditure on arms, even predating the Ukrainian war, there was a massive increase in Western expenditure on weapons. So the military industrial complex are profiting from this. The authoritarians and the warmongers on all sides are quite happy to see this thing escalate. And that's all the more reason why ordinary people who can see the madness of this and the danger of it need to unite together. To fight against our own governments who are trying to push us in this direction, and to act in solidarity with one another as we resist governments that are trying to drive us in this terrifying direction.
The global policy of neutrality?
A global policy of neutrality, exactly.
Really?
Neutrality it doesn't mean indifference, far from it. And I think that's the point I hope I'm trying to make about Irish neutrality. Irish neutrality is a radical, it's a revolutionary position of saying we don't align with oppressors and warmongers and empires.
Richard Boyd Barett, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks.